"Your mother was Apache," said the missionary to the blue-eyed boy who'd always felt like a stranger. "I spent my entire childhood wondering why I looked different, why I felt like a stranger in my own home." The answer was hidden in a mission cemetery all along. The mission bell tolled noon, its bronze voice echoing across the dry valley like a prayer nobody wanted to hear. Thomas sat on the wooden steps of the chapel, whittling a piece of oak with his father's old knife, the same knife that had carved their dinner table and fixed the fence posts and done 100 small kindnesses over the years. The wood curled away from the blade in thin spirals, falling to the dust between his boots like tiny prayers. Father Miguel emerged from the shadow of the doorway, his black robes moving slow as smoke in the still air. The old priest had been watching Thomas for weeks now, something heavy sitting behind his dark eyes, something that made the boy feel like he was standing at the edge of a cliff he couldn't see. "Thomas," the priest said, settling beside him on the step. The adobe was warm beneath them, holding the morning sun like a promise. "We need to speak." The boy kept whittling, not looking up. He could feel the weight of words gathering in the space between them, heavy as thunderclouds before a storm. His hands knew the rhythm of the knife, the gentle pressure needed to coax the wood into something new, something better than what it was. "About what, Father?" Miguel was quiet for a long moment, watching the wood fall away in careful curls. A lizard darted across the courtyard, disappearing beneath a stone worn smooth by countless feet. The mission had stood here for 30 years, built on ground that had been sacred to someone else first, built with hands that belonged to people who were told their old gods were wrong. "About your mother," Miguel said finally. Thomas's knife went still. In 16 years, his father had spoken of his mother exactly 7 times, always in half sentences that ended in silence, always with eyes that looked somewhere else. "She died when you were a small boy. She was beautiful. She loved you more than the desert loves rain. Nothing more, nothing whole, nothing that felt like truth." "What about her?" Thomas asked, though his voice came out smaller than he meant it to. The priest reached into his robes and pulled out a photograph, the edges worn soft with handling. It showed a woman with dark hair and eyes like midnight, standing beside a younger version of Thomas's father. She was beautiful, yes, but not in the way white women in town were beautiful. Her beauty was different, older, like something that had grown up from the earth itself. "Her name was Evening Star," Miguel said, his voice gentle as rain on leaves. "Your father called her Eva. She was Apache." The words hit Thomas like a physical thing, like a fist to the chest that knocked all the air from his lungs. The knife slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the step. "Apache." The word echoed in his mind, bouncing off the walls of everything he thought he knew about himself, about his place in this world. He had always felt like a stranger in his own skin, always wondered why his blue eyes looked so wrong in the mirror, why his hair caught the sun like wheat when everyone else in his father's family had hair dark as river stones. The other boys in town had always known their mother's faces, their mother's songs, their mother's hands that braided their hair and mended their clothes. Thomas had only questions and silence. "Apache," he whispered, the word strange on his tongue. Miguel nodded, placing the photograph in Thomas's trembling hands. "She was 16 when she met your father. He was working the silver mines up near the mountains, and she was gathering medicine plants by the creek. They fell in love the way young people do, sudden and complete, like drought breaking with rain." Thomas stared at the photograph, seeing himself in the curve of her mouth, in the way she stood with one hip cocked, comfortable in her own body. But it was her eyes that stopped his breath. They looked at the camera like they were looking into the future, like they could see him sitting here 16 years later, holding her image with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "Why didn't he tell me?" The priest's face was heavy with old sorrow. "Because the world made it dangerous to be Apache. Because white folks in these parts have long memories and short mercy. Because he loved you and wanted you to be safe." The mission yard stretched before them, filled with graves marked by simple wooden crosses, some so old the names had worn away to nothing. Thomas thought about all the Apache buried in unmarked ground, all the mothers whose children would never know their faces, their names, their stories. The silence felt enormous, like something that could swallow him whole. She died when the fever came through the reservation. Miguel continued. Your father brought you here when you were barely 2 years old, small as a sparrow and twice as fierce. Said you cried for your mother in Apache words he couldn't understand. Thomas closed his eyes, trying to remember something, anything that felt like truth. Sometimes in dreams, he heard singing in a language that felt like home, felt hands braiding his hair with gentle fingers. He had always thought those were just dreams, just his mind making stories to fill the empty spaces. Do I have family? The question came out raw, barely a whisper. Apache family? Miguel was quiet for a long time, watching the desert wind move through the scrub brush beyond the mission walls. Finally, he nodded. Your mother's sister, Desert Rose. She lives up north, near the mountains where the old Apache trails wind through the pines. She's been asking about you for years. The world tilted. Thomas felt like he was falling, though he hadn't moved from the step. Family. Real family, blood family. People who might have his mother's eyes and know his mother's songs. People who would understand why he felt like a stranger in every room he entered, why he dreamed in colors that had no names. Why tell me now, he asked. Miguel's smile was sad and knowing. Because you're 16 now, old enough to choose your own path. And because your aunt sent word that she's dying. The winter sickness. If you want to know her, to know where you come from, it has to be soon. Thomas looked at the photograph again, at his mother's face that was somehow his face, at the story written in her eyes that he was only beginning to understand. The mission bell tolled the half hour, its voice carrying across the valley to places he had never been, to people he had never met who shared his blood and his bones. He thought about his father, working the ranch 20 miles south, believing he was protecting his son by keeping him from the truth. He thought about the white families in town who had always looked at him sideways, like they could sense something different about him but couldn't name what it was. He thought about Evening Star, his mother, dying young and far from the mountain she loved. The wind picked up, stirring the dust around their feet, and Thomas felt something shifting inside him, like a door opening that had been locked his whole life. He was Apache. He was the son of Evening Star. He belonged somewhere, to someone, in ways he had never imagined possible. How far north? He asked, his voice steady now, sure in ways it had never been before. Miguel smiled, and for the first time in weeks, the heaviness behind his eyes lifted a little. 3 days' ride, if you know the way. Longer if you don't. Thomas stood, folding the photograph carefully and slipping it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart where it belonged. The knife lay forgotten on the step, the piece of oak half-carved, waiting for hands that might never return to finish what they had started. Somewhere to the north, in the mountains where his mother's people had always lived, an aunt he had never met was waiting to tell him who he really was. The asphalt gave way to gravel, then to dirt, then to nothing but hardpan and thorns. Thomas drove until his fuel gauge kissed empty, until the road became a suggestion, until the headlights carved a lonely tunnel through darkness that seemed to swallow sound itself. When the engine finally coughed its last breath, he sat in the sudden silence, hands still gripping the wheel like a lifeline to a world that no longer made sense. The questions followed him out of the car and into the desert night. Who was Sarah Martinez? The name echoed in his skull with each footstep on the cracked earth. Why had his mother, the woman who raised him, loved him, lied to him for 34 years, kept this secret locked away like a shameful thing? He walked without direction, rage propelling him forward through clusters of Palo Verde and Brittlebush. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a moonlit sea of silver and shadow that made his problems seem both insignificant and impossibly large. Above him, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to his confusion, mocking his certainty that the world had rules, that families told the truth, that birth certificates meant something. The air tasted of sage and dust, of secrets older than his personal crisis. Each breath burned his lungs, but he welcomed the pain. It was honest, unlike everything else in his life. His dress shoes, designed for courthouse floors and conference rooms, stumbled over rocks and caught in the thorny embrace of Cholla. By the time he stopped walking, his shirt clung to his back with sweat despite the desert's nighttime chill. That's when he saw her. The old woman moved through the moonlight like she belonged to it, her long gray hair loose around her shoulders, traditional turquoise jewelry catching starlight as she knelt among the desert plants. Her weathered hands worked with practiced precision, selecting stems and leaves, placing them carefully in a woven basket. She seemed as much a part of the landscape as the saguaros that stood sentinel around her, their arms raised in permanent supplication to the sky. Thomas froze, suddenly aware that he was trespassing, not just on land, but on something sacred. The woman's presence transformed the empty desert into a place with history, with meaning, with stories that predated his confusion by centuries. She looked up as if sensing his thoughts. Her face was a map of the Southwest, lined by sun and wind and decades of watching. But her eyes, dark as obsidian, sharp as flint, saw him with an intensity that made him feel transparent. She studied him for a long moment, her head tilted slightly, and Thomas had the unsettling feeling that she was seeing not just who he was, but who he might have been. "You're lost," she said finally. Her voice carried the cadence of two languages, English overlaid on something deeper, older. Thomas started, then stopped. The simple truth of her statement hit him harder than any legal brief ever had. Yes. She nodded as if this were the most natural thing in the world, as if men in torn business shirts stumbled into the desert every night carrying their broken lives. "My name is Maria Sandoval, and you look like someone I used to know." The way she said it made Thomas's chest tighten. "I don't think we've met." "Not you," Maria said, rising gracefully from her crouch. "But your eyes." She moved closer, and Thomas caught the scent of sage and cedar, of smoke and starlight. "Your mother's eyes." The word hit him like a physical blow. "My mother is dead." "Which one?" Thomas stared at her. In the moonlight, Maria's face was kind but implacable, weathered by truth-telling. "What do you mean, which one? The one who raised you, or the one who bore you?" Maria's voice was gentle, but it carried the weight of certainty. "The one who gave your name, or the one who gave you those eyes?" Thomas felt the desert spin around him. How could you possibly? Because 35 years ago, a girl named Sarah Martinez came to me, heavy with child and heavy with sorrow. Maria's words fell into the silence between them like stones dropped in still water, each one sending ripples through Thomas's understanding. "She was Apache like me. Like you. That's impossible." But even as he said it, Thomas was remembering fragments. The way his mother had always gone quiet when he asked about his father, the birth certificate with no father's name, the way certain songs on the radio made her eyes distant and sad. Maria reached into her basket and pulled out a stem of white sage, crushing it between her fingers. The scent rose between them, sharp and cleansing. Sarah was 17, beautiful, stubborn as the desert itself. She came from the reservation with a story about a boy who promised her the world and left her with something more precious. "You're talking about me." "I'm talking about blood calling to blood," Maria said. "About mothers and sons, about the stories we carry in our bones, even when our minds forget them." She held out her hand, palm up, and in the moonlight, Thomas could see the lines etched there like a map. "Sarah held you for 3 days after you were born. 3 days of loving you so fierce it nearly killed her to let you go." Thomas felt something crack inside his chest. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because the desert remembers what we forget," Maria said. "Because you came here looking for answers, and Sarah asked me to watch for you." Her smile was sad and knowing. She said someday you'd come looking. Said you'd have her eyes and her stubbornness, and you'd want to know why you never felt like you fit. The truth of it hit Thomas like a flood. All the years of feeling displaced, of loving his adoptive parents, but never quite understanding why he looked at the world differently, why certain landscapes called to him, why he'd driven into the desert tonight instead of toward any logical destination. "She's still alive?" The question barely made it past his throat. Maria's expression shifted, became carefully neutral. Sarah made choices. Hard ones. The kind that leave marks on the soul. She tucked the sage back in her basket. But blood is blood, and the desert keeps its promises. You're here now. That's what matters. Thomas looked around at the vast landscape, at the stars that no longer seemed mocking, but ancient and knowing. The rage that had driven him into the night was transforming into something else. Not peace, not yet, but a recognition that his story was larger than he'd imagined, older than his 34 years, rooted in this harsh and beautiful land. What do I do now? He asked. Maria shouldered her basket and began walking back toward the shadows. You remember, she called over her shoulder. You listen. And tomorrow, when the sun rises, you decide who you want to be. Thomas watched her disappear into the desert darkness, leaving him alone with the stars and the sage-scented wind and the growing certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The morning air tasted different here, wilder, older. Maria moved ahead of Thomas through the mesquite and Palo Verde, her weathered boots finding paths that weren't quite paths, following contours of the land that seemed to remember different feet, different purposes. The sun painted long shadows across the desert floor, and Thomas found himself walking more quietly than usual, as if the very ground demanded reverence. Not much farther, Maria said without turning around. Her voice carried differently in this place, softer somehow, like she was speaking to more than just him. They had been walking since before dawn, leaving the main camp while the others still slept. Maria had shaken him awake with urgent hands, pressing a canteen and dried meat into his palms. Today, she'd whispered, today you learn about the water that flows uphill. Now, as they crested a low rise thick with ocotillo, Thomas understood what she meant. Below them lay a hidden basin where green grew impossibly lush, where cottonwoods clustered around pools of water that caught the morning light like scattered coins. But it was more than an oasis. Scattered among the trees were the remains of wickiups, their wooden frames still standing like the ribs of sleeping giants. Your mother played here, Maria said, her hand finding Thomas's shoulder. Before the soldiers came. Before the promises that broke like pottery in the wind. Thomas's throat tightened. In all his 18 years, no one had spoken of his mother except in careful euphemisms. The Indian woman who had died birthing him, the unfortunate circumstances of his father's brief liaison with someone from the reservation. His father's people had painted her as a shadow, a mistake, something to be overcome rather than remembered. They descended into the basin, and Maria led him to a clear pool where the water ran both directions, upstream and down simultaneously, defying everything Thomas thought he knew about how water should behave. The old ones knew places like this, Maria said, kneeling beside the impossible water, where the world shows you it has its own rules. Your mother brought me here once when we were girls. She said the water remembered which way was home. From her weathered bag, Maria produced a tin box wrapped in faded cloth. Her fingers shook slightly as she unwrapped it, and Thomas found himself holding his breath. She left these with me, said if anything happened to her, if the two worlds she lived between ever became one world again, I should show them to you. Inside the box were photographs. Not many, but enough to change everything. Thomas's hands trembled as he lifted the first one. A young Apache woman with his own dark eyes, standing beside a wickiup with two small children clinging to her skirts. Her smile was radiant, unguarded, nothing like the tragic figure his father's family had described. That's her, Maria said unnecessarily. Rosa. With her first children, before the fever took them. Before she met your father. The second photograph stole Thomas's breath entirely. His mother and father together. His father impossibly young and clean-shaven, wearing clothes Thomas had never seen him in, simple work clothes instead of his usual store-bought suits. His arm was around Rosa's shoulders, and they were both laughing at something outside the frame. They looked happy. They looked like they belonged together. He loved her, Thomas whispered. He did, and she loved him. But love doesn't stop bullets, and it doesn't stop the world from changing around you. Maria's voice grew heavy as she continued. The soldiers came through in '85, said all Apache children had to go to the school in Carlisle. Kill the Indian, save the man, that was their promise. Rosa hid in the mountains with her little ones rather than send them away. But the fever found them anyway. Took both babies in 3 days. Thomas traced his finger along the edge of his mother's photograph. She had been someone before she was his mother, someone with a full life, with loss and love and laughter. Someone with a name that wasn't just the Indian woman. She met your father at the trading post 6 months later. He was different then, younger, less afraid of what people might say. He saw her for who she was, not what she'd lost. For a while, they made their own world here in the desert. But worlds have a way of colliding. The sound of hoofbeats broke the morning stillness like stones through glass. Maria's head snapped up, her hand moving instinctively to the knife at her belt. In the distance, dust rose against the sky. 3 riders, maybe 4, moving fast toward the basin. Hide the photographs, Maria hissed, but Thomas was already tucking them inside his shirt, the metal edges cool against his skin. Those men, I know their horses. They work for the territorial marshal. The riders appeared at the rim of the basin, their horses foam-flecked and breathing hard. Thomas recognized the lead rider, Deputy Morrison, who'd been sniffing around the edges of Apache communities for months, looking for any excuse to make trouble. Well, Morrison called down to them, his voice echoing off the stone walls. What do we have here? Maria Segundo and the Whitman boy, having themselves a little picnic in Apache territory. Thomas felt the photographs against his chest like burning coals. Everything hung in the balance. The careful story of his life, the lies that kept him safe in his father's world, the dangerous truth of who he really was. We're just collecting medicinal plants, Thomas called up, his voice steadier than he felt. It was the same lie he'd been telling all his life, that he was just Thomas Whitman, helping the Apache woman who worked for his father. Nothing more complicated than simple Christian charity. Morrison guided his horse down the steep path, his deputies following. Funny thing about medicinal plants, he said, dismounting near the pool where the water ran both ways. They don't usually grow in sacred Apache sites. This place has been off-limits to whites for years, boy. What makes you think you belong here? The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Thomas could feel Maria's eyes on him, could sense the weight of choice pressing down like the desert sun. He could tell the same lies he'd always told, deny any connection to this place, to his mother's people, to the truth burning against his ribs. It would be safer. It would be easier. But as he looked at the water flowing impossibly upstream, carrying its memory of home against all logic and law, Thomas felt something shift inside him. The photographs against his chest seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. I belong here, Thomas said quietly, because my mother played here as a child, because her people have walked this ground for generations, because the water remembers which way is home. Morrison's hand moved to his gun. Your mother was Apache? She was. Thomas straightened his shoulders. Hausa Segundo. And I am her son. The words hung in the morning air like a prayer, like a declaration of war, like the sound of a world splitting open to show what had always been true underneath. Maria's weathered hand found his, squeezing once, brief and fierce. The water continued its impossible journey, flowing both ways at once, carrying the past toward the future and the future back to the past, while the men with badges tried to decide which direction trouble would flow. The morning sun painted the desert floor in shades of copper and gold as Thomas stood at the place where 2 worlds met. The hidden canyon where Maria had shown him the truth and the dusty trail that led back to the only life he had ever known. His hands still trembled from touching the photographs, from seeing his mother's face for the first time, from hearing her name spoken aloud. Ayana, meaning eternal blossom in the Apache tongue. The riders had come and gone in the night, their torches casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls as they searched for something, or someone, they never found. Maria had pressed her weathered hand to his mouth, her eyes urgent in the firelight, and whispered the choice that now lay before him like a river with two channels. You can return as Thomas Murphy, the foundling boy, and live safely in their world. Or you can carry your mother's name with you, knowing it may cost you everything. He had chosen silence then, crouched behind the ancient petroglyphs while the searchers passed. But now, in the clarity of dawn, Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, a settling, like stones finding their place in a stream bed. He was no longer the boy who had ridden out yesterday, hungry for answers he thought he wanted. He was someone new, someone who had looked into the mirror of his own history and seen a face that was both foreign and familiar. The town of Esperanza appeared before him like a mirage, wavering in the heat that was already beginning to rise from the hardpan. The same wooden buildings, the same dusty streets, the same bell tower of the mission rising against the endless blue sky. But Thomas saw it all differently now, saw how the settlement had been built on the bones of another life, another way of being. The mission where Father Gabriel had raised him stood on ground that had once echoed with the laughter of Apache children, children who had played in the shade of mesquite trees before the soldiers came with their fire and their promises. He guided his horse down the main street, aware of eyes following his progress. Mrs. Henderson peered at him from behind her lace curtains, her mouth pursed in its perpetual expression of disapproval. Young Billy Carter waved from the mercantile steps, but Thomas barely registered the greeting. His attention was fixed on something else now, something that had always been there, but which he had never truly seen. At the stable, old Pete took the reins without comment, though his rheumy eyes lingered on Thomas's face with an expression that might have been recognition. "You look different, boy," Pete said finally, his voice gravelly from years of tobacco and dust. "Like you've been places." Thomas nodded, unsure how to explain the journey that had taken him not miles, but years into the past. "I have," he said simply. Father Gabriel was waiting in the mission courtyard, his black robes rustling in the morning breeze. The priest's face was unreadable, but Thomas caught something in his eyes, a weariness, perhaps, or a sadness, so old it had worn grooves in his features like water wearing stone. "Thomas," the father said, his voice carefully neutral, "I trust your excursion was enlightening." The word hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Thomas understood now that Father Gabriel had always known more than he let on, had always been aware of the questions that lay buried beneath the boy's upbringing. The priest had raised him with kindness, but also with careful silences, teaching him to read and write and pray, while never speaking of the woman who had brought him to the mission steps 20 years ago, dying and desperate, and whispering words in a language the good father claimed not to understand. "It was," Thomas replied, meeting the priest's gaze steadily. "I know who I am now." Father Gabriel's shoulders seemed to sag slightly, as if a burden he had carried for 2 decades was finally being set down. "And what will you do with that knowledge?" Thomas looked past the priest to the mission cemetery, where unmarked graves lay in neat rows beneath the cottonwoods. He had walked among those stones countless times, never understanding that some of them might shelter the bones of his people, never knowing that the flowers Maria tended there were placed with love and remembrance, not mere Christian charity. "I will live," Thomas said, "as myself." That afternoon, he walked to the cemetery alone, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. The sun was high and harsh, but he welcomed its weight on his shoulders, welcomed the way it made him squint and see the world through narrowed eyes, the way Maria had taught him his ancestors saw, carefully, missing nothing. He found the corner where the unmarked graves lay, their wooden crosses weathered gray and smooth. Here lay the Apache dead, the ones who had died in the mission's early days, when the line between conversion and captivity was thin as spider silk. Here, perhaps, lay children who had never seen their homeland again, elders who had died with their true names unspoken. Thomas knelt and began to plant the desert flowers Maria had given him, brilliant red blooms that thrived in the harsh soil, that asked nothing but sun and silence to flourish. As he worked, he whispered words in Apache, phrases Maria had taught him, his tongue stumbling over syllables that should have been as familiar as breath, but felt foreign in his mouth. "Ayana," he whispered, speaking his mother's name to the desert wind. "I am your son. I remember you now." The flowers took root easily in the sandy soil, their colors vivid against the muted browns and grays of the cemetery. As he worked, Thomas felt something loosening inside him, some tight knot of longing and confusion that had lived in his chest for as long as he could remember. He was still Thomas Murphy, the foundling raised by the mission. That part of him would always exist. But he was also something else now, something that had been waiting inside him all these years like a seed in drought, needing only the right conditions to grow. A shadow fell across the grave he was tending, and he looked up to see Father Gabriel standing nearby, his face creased with an expression Thomas had never seen before, something that might have been regret or relief or both. "She would be proud," the priest said quietly. "Your mother. She would be proud to see the man you've become." Thomas felt tears he had been holding back for days finally spill over, cutting clean tracks through the dust on his cheeks. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Father Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the desert met the sky in a shimmering line. "Because I was afraid," he said at last. "Afraid of losing you. Afraid of what the truth might cost us both." The admission hung between them like a bridge, fragile but real. Thomas understood that the priest had loved him in his own way, had tried to protect him from a world that would have seen his Apache blood as a stain to be scrubbed away. But protection and love were not the same thing, and sometimes the greatest kindness was to let someone carry their own burdens, to walk their own path even when it led through thorny places. As the sun began to set, painting the cemetery in shades of gold and amber, Thomas finished planting the last of the flowers. He stood slowly, brushing dirt from his knees, and looked down at the small garden he had created. It was not much, a few bright blooms in an ocean of dust and stone, but it was a beginning, a way of saying, "I see you. I remember. You are not forgotten." Walking back toward the mission, Thomas felt the weight of his new knowledge settling around his shoulders like a cloak. He was no longer the boy who had ridden out in search of answers. He was a man who had found not just his history, but himself, complex and contradictory, carrying both the mission's teachings and his mother's blood, belonging fully to neither world, but finding a way to honor both. Tomorrow there would be questions, sideways glances, whispered conversations about the Murphy boy who had come back changed. There would be choices to make about how much truth to reveal, how much of himself to protect. But tonight, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thomas Murphy, son of Ayana, child of two worlds, walked home knowing exactly who he was.